Today, Dr. Collins will present on labor force participation, a topic central to the nation and Mississippi's workforce. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Sondra Collins today.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I do not like being tied to a mic, so is it okay if I walk around? Can you guys hear me? Perfect. Thank you so much. So my name is Sondra Collins. I work in Mississippi in our office of the state economist. And so this is not an academic paper. How many people here are students? I want to just get a little feel for. So there's some students. How many people are professionals but not economists? Like other professionals. Okay. Great. So I see this as being very much. You are having trouble hearing me? All right, so I guess I'm back over here. All right, so I see this as being a nice, cozy conversation on this nice, cool December day. We're going to talk about labor force. This is not an empirical paper, so it should be accessible to the students, to the non-econ people. And we're going to talk a little bit about what we do in our office. So in my office, which is the Office of the State Economist, we do research for our legislatures, things that they are interested in. And one of the things that they're interested in, especially in Mississippi right now, is how can we improve our labor force participation rate? So let's talk about what labor force participation is and what it is not. So when we calculate this labor force participation rate, we're looking at the working age population. So who's in the working age population? Everybody that's 16 and older, that's not in any kind of institution, is part of the labor force. It's part of the working age population. So they're part of our denominator. The top number is the people who are employed and the people who are not employed, but are looking for some type of work. And so that's why the number's not the same. So we see this starts in 1970, just because that's the year that I picked to start this graph. And our labor force participation is about 60%. And then it goes up well into the 90s. It kind of flattens out. And then it starts to come down in the 2000s. And so there's lots of reasons for the increase and the decrease. And we're going to talk about them in a little while. But first, I want to show you why this is such a big deal in Mississippi. I think. All right. So we talk about this in Mississippi. In 1975 is when we start getting the state rates. And Mississippi is already below the nation, right? So the top line is the U.S. rates. The bottom line is Mississippi. The Great Recession started around 2007. You see that we have a big drop. We kind of recover, but then in 2012, we drop again. And we're not really sure why that drop happened, and we never really recover. And of course, the pandemic is that second deep drop that you see in 2020. And so this is a lot. We have this conversation a lot because what's happening? And should we care, right? So should we be trying to get labor force participation to 100%? Absolutely not, right? We don't necessarily need it to be 100% for reasons that we'll talk about later, but we do want to at least be where the nation is. Now, when I started this and I told Nikisia that this is what I wanted to talk about, I had my ideas of where I thought Georgia would fit in. And I want to know what you guys think before I go to the next slide and show you where Georgia is. So, option one, do we think Georgia will be below the Mississippi line? Option two, do we think it'll be between Mississippi and the U.S.? Or option three, do we think Georgia will be above? So I want you to vote. So how many people think option one, that Georgia's below the Mississippi labor force participation? How many people think option two, that it's somewhere in between? And how many people think option three, that is above? All right. So I expected option two, but here we are, right? We are actually, for much of the time period, right up into the Great Recession, a good bit above the U.S. The Great Recession kind of gets you even with the U.S., and then the pandemic kind of puts you a little bit behind the U.S. So, not bad. But why? Why is Georgia doing so much better than Mississippi? And one answer is Atlanta, right? And so a couple years ago in Mississippi, being a very rural state, our previous state economists looked at all the southern states and took out all the cities and said, now, now what does it look like? Because we don't have a city in Mississippi, right? I live in Jackson, Mississippi. That's our state capital. Jackson, the city population is about 150,000 people, and the metro area is about 500,000 people. And that is the biggest city that we have in the state of Mississippi. So we don't have a city, all right? By contrast, if you're wondering, the city of Atlanta's population is about 500,000 people in the city, and the metro area is about 6 million people. So we are far, far behind, actually having a big city in our state. But when we take out the cities and we look at the rural areas all over the South, then we are about the same when we look at things like wage increases, labor force participation, all kinds of different economic metrics, education, right? All those things are just better in the city, right? And it's because cities reward people better for being better educated, participating in the labor force, you get better wages, all those types of things. So I didn't expect it to Atlanta to be so great, but congratulations. All right. So I said we were going to talk about a little bit about why with labor force participation. So the first thing we see is that in the 70s, it starts to go up into the 90s, right? And before it starts to come back down. So why this big increase? And the answer is women. You guys are welcome. So women are starting to enter the workforce more in the 70s and 80s. And it's becoming more socially acceptable, right? For a lot of reasons, right? Because back during World War I and World War II, women were entering the labor force, but they were told, okay, the men are home now, time for you to go back to being a homemaker. 70s and 80s is becoming more acceptable. Our parents, if you were an 80s baby, 70s baby, told you, you'll be fine at home for a couple hours by yourself. Don't kill yourself. And if you do, I'll kill you when I get home, right? Other people's parents said something very close to that, right? That was socially acceptable during that time period. So we get these parents going to work. We have these two-income households in the 70s, 80s, into the 90s. In the 90s, what we see is, trade is coming in. Some of these manufacturing jobs are going away. The same thing that's affecting the U.S. is affecting women, right? We've kind of hit our limit. But I also want to say, during the 70s and 80s, education was becoming more accessible to women, higher education in particular. And so that is happening in the U.S., and that is what's happening with women as well. So during this time, what is happening with men? Here's men, all right? So men's labor force participation in the 70s is at about 80%. And it starts to come down, and it's also moving, with the different things that are happening in the economy. Is it so bad in the 70s that men's labor force participation rate is coming down, right? A lot of times this is sold to us as a tragedy, but it's not all tragedy. I mentioned that in the 70s and 80s, women were having more access to higher education, but men also had better access and more access to higher education in the 70s and 80s. So it was in 65, if I remember, there was a Higher Ed Act that was passed, and it allowed us to expand student loans. So before 1965, there was a bill that gave student loans to people. It was part of a Defense Act, right? And so if you were studying engineering or something that they felt like could be helped in defense, right? You can go into the military, you can do something that can help boost the military, you qualify for student loans. But if you weren't in those spaces, you didn't qualify. 1965, pretty much every major qualifies. And not only do we now qualify for student loans, the bill had an express interest in increasing economic mobility. And so people on the lower and middle income brackets were encouraged to take out these student loans, go to college, get a degree, get a better job, that type of thing. And so we see, remember, everybody who's 16 and over is included in the labor force. Well, now some of those 16 to 24-year-olds, men, are going to college instead of going into the workforce. And so they're dropping out of the labor force because if you're not looking for work, you're not a part of this labor force. And so is that tragic that we have these men going to college now and delaying entry into the workforce? It's not tragic. Right? That's actually a pretty positive thing. Another thing that's happening in the 70s and 80s is that pensions are becoming more popular and accessible, right? So people who worked in the 50s and 60s are starting to be able to take their pensions and actually have a full retirement. So if you're fully retired and you're not looking for work, you're also not part of the labor force. So even though we see, a lot of people see this as a tragedy from the 70s to 90s with this, where are all the men? It's not as tragic as it looks because on those age extremes, men are either bettering themselves at the younger side or they're actually retiring but still able to take care of themselves on the other side. Now, we do have some not so great things happening, right? The manufacturing jobs are going away and that does hurt some men and women, right? We talked about it on the other slide. Because they are either having to try to figure out how to retrain or they're leaving the labor force altogether. And we had that pandemic at the end still. Just because you're probably curious, we'll put everything here together so you can see the men and the women at the same time. Now, all of this is great, right? This is a great introduction to the labor force and where we are. But remember, when you're thinking about this from the point of legislation, it's like, what can we do to get people into the workforce, to encourage this labor force participation? We don't want to discourage education, but what about those prime age people in the middle that we do want working, right? They're not in education, they're not retired. We still have seen a drop in labor force for those people, right? What's going on and how do we make that a little bit better? So I'm going to start here with incarceration. So I know if you were listening, you heard me say people who are institutionalized don't count as part of this labor force. So then why do we care about incarceration if we're thinking about labor force and those people don't count? We care because at some point they get released, right? And once they're released, they do count. And we know that those people who have committed a crime, served some time, and been released have a really hard time participating in the labor force. And so we want to figure out ways to kind of make that a little bit better. So what are states doing for some of these people who are previously incarcerated and need some work? So one thing that's happening is we realized licensing is a problem, right? So for a lot of different jobs, you have to get a license or a certificate, right? Let's say you want to drive a forklift or you want to be a barber or like all kinds of jobs have different certifications, licensing requirements. There was so many license requirements that had blanket, no criminal record type requirements. Well, it makes sense that if you defrauded a bank, you should not be able to be a licensed banker, right? Nobody's arguing that fact. But if you defrauded a bank, should you be able to drive a truck? right? Should you be able to get CDL license? Probably, maybe. I mean, not driving for a bank, but driving for somebody else, probably it's okay. Should you be able to cut hair? Right? Barbers need license. Probably that's okay. And so in Mississippi and in other states, we're seeing people really go through those licensing requirements and not allow those blanket, no criminal record type requirements. They're really trying to make it to where, yes, if you committed a crime that's going to prevent you from doing this job well or may, you know, lead you down a path where you can commit the same crime again, yes, we don't want that. But we don't want to completely lock you out of everything that requires a license either. So that's one thing that we're doing. We're doing a lot of just conversations with employers to let them know that, just because somebody has a criminal record, period, right, doesn't mean you don't hire them, right? Because employers still have their discretion. They can still hire whoever they want to hire, fire who they want to fire, but we want to, have those conversations. Another thing that's really big is reentry. It's really hard to get a job without an address, right? And so if people don't have a place to live, they can't even get through a job application, especially not now when these job applications are online and they'll kick you out if you can't put an address in. And also, having a place to live is nice. It's nice to have. It kind of gets you ready for work during the day. So some of these reentry programs are trying to help with housing, help also with counseling, mental health, reentry. Some of these programs we have in Mississippi, some of them we don't, and some things we're trying to figure out. But we see other states doing it really well, and so we're trying to learn from others. How do you help people reenter? Because it's really important. And the last thing is expungement. All right, some states are better at it than others, but actually allowing people to check a box that says I do not have a criminal record, right? Because their record has been expunged, is a really good way to help boost their work availability. And we don't want to do that for every heinous crime that could be committed. But then there are some things that we definitely think people should be given a second chance. And so where's the line? That's conversations that people are trying to have. Now, just to convince you that this is an important labor force thing and that states matter, right? States tend to decide what counts as a misdemeanor and what counts as a felony conviction. That's mostly state level policy and decisions. And sometimes we're surprised by the things the states will decide is a felony as opposed to misdemeanor. And they've been increasing, especially in the 70s to 90s when we had the war on drugs. And just the tough on crime era in general. We saw a lot of things become felonies that hadn't previously been felonies. And we're trying to fix it. A lot of states are really trying to kind of fix that now. A lot of the decrease you see also was from the pandemic where people said, okay, we're going to try to, lighten the prison load so that the disease doesn't transmit as much. But some of it is just generally states saying, hey, how can we be better? Or how can we be better for our citizens? And so we see some of that. Another thing people say is it's a small part of the population. It is a small part of the population that's actually incarcerated. But then we want to think about the people who've been formerly incarcerated. And then there's so many people who have had a felony conviction, but different state laws will let certain felonies go without actually serving time, right? It may just be probation or house arrest or something like that. But look at this bottom number. Somebody who has an immediate family member who has actually not just committed a crime, but actually was previously incarcerated. That's about a third of the U.S. population. About a third, an immediate family member. And we don't have that for any felony, but you can imagine that number goes up. And so we do want to be helping these families because the entire family is affected by this. All right, moving on to childcare. Childcare is another thing that keeps people out of the labor force in a big way. If you've ever even considered talking to a daycare, you know how outrageous this can be. And that's another thing. So a big part of it is when we talk about childcare, very often we only think about daycare, like birth to like age 5, and then they go to kindergarten. And for some reason, as a society, we almost forget about the kids. And because we're not in that era anymore where parents will leave their kids at home and say, if you mess up, I'll kill you, right? Then we have to have somebody actually watching these kids. So this chart is the percentage of income that a family will pay for childcare, but it's an average across all childcare. Now, it doesn't include stuff like summer camps and ballet practice and that type of thing. It's just, I need to go to work. Either my kid is not in school, like that 0 to 5, or they are in school, 5 to about 13 or 14, and I still need somebody else to watch them after school. So there's that aftercare and that all day care for young kids, all averaged out. And we look at all families. So all families are spending about 8 to 10% of their income on childcare. But that second line is low-income families. This is what low-income families are paying on childcare. And I know a lot of us are thinking, well, there's vouchers and there's, all these different programs. Georgia has universal pre-K to a certain extent, right? I think the states that have full universal pre-K are Vermont. It's a couple of them. They have but Georgia's is lottery money, right? So everybody's eligible until the money runs out, and then you kind of don't have any more money for childcare. But this is even considering those things because, for the most part, once your kid's out of pre-K, there's not a lot of vouchers for aftercare and a lot of systems. So these parents are still having to pay this out of pocket. And here's where I used to say, nobody's thought about universal child care for all children. And last month, the state of New Mexico introduced universal child care for 0 to 13-year-olds. It's all your full day up until they go to kindergarten and all your aftercare until they turn 13. And if they have special needs, they can stay. They will pay for your care beyond age 13. And so, amazing. It literally started November 1st of this year. So, we still have to wait and see what the implications are going to be moving forward, but I think it's absolutely amazing. And yeah, they took away my little line where I used to always say, nobody's thought about this. New Mexico has thought about it. They're implementing it, and that's great. I can still say nobody's thought about a universal elder care program, right? Because as expensive and time-consuming as child care is, elder care is also keeping people out of the labor force. And because in the 80s and 90s especially, people start really delaying childbirth, we're finding ourselves in a situation where a lot of people in their 30s, 40s, and 50s are caring for both their kids and their parents, right? Because of that. And so if the kids don't keep you out of the labor force, the parents just might. And so how are we going to address that? And most states don't have real solutions. We rely on Medicaid and Medicare, or Medicare for everybody who's ever worked, right? They have some care. Medicaid covers those low-income people and kind of catches some things that Medicare doesn't, but none of it is actually comprehensive. And so there's a lot of space for us to really think about how do we help people when it comes to elder care, and how do we keep those elders in a place of dignity, because a lot of times people don't want to go into those institutions because they don't feel like those institutions offer them a lot of dignity. And people our age don't want to send our parents there because we don't feel like those institutions always offer them a lot of dignity. And so how do we deal with that legislatively? It's something that we've been talking about and thinking about a lot. Another thing that's really important is disabilities. So when I meet legislators in Mississippi, and I can only talk about my own state, but when I meet them and we talk about disabilities, they often assume that people with disabilities don't count in the labor force. And that's just absolutely not true. All right. So if you're not in an institution, you pretty much count. And that's whether you are 10 and this, well, not 10, sorry, 10-year-olds are not in the labor force at all. Not in this country, not yet. So, but if you are 18, right, and disabled, or whether you're 80 and disabled, if you're not in an institution, you still count in the labor force. And I also want to point out, if you have people who are, 100 years old and not in an institution, they still count. Remember I said we don't want that number to ever be 100%. Do we ever want to force somebody that's 100 years old and in good health to go to work? I would like to stop working soon. Right, so I definitely don't want to force somebody who's done their duty and worked their years and got there and earned their retirement to go back to work. So that's something else that we have to be really careful about. Like, we want the number to increase, but we want to make sure we're increasing the number for all the right reasons. Back to disabilities, though. So this is labor force participation for everybody and the disability rate. So disability rates increasing. This is the national one. Mississippi is more. So the national average right now is around 10% of the population says they have some type of disability, self-reported. Mississippi is about 16%. And so we have to think about why. Why do we have more? Right? Some disabilities, obviously, people are born with those things and there's nothing we can do. But there are some things that we can do on two different ends. So first, we can try to prevent some disabilities with safety regulations. We find that a lot of people become disabled at work, right? They fall off a ladder. Well, we can make it so where they have to have a harness, so they are less likely to, become disabled from falling off a ladder or cutting off a finger, right? We can do all these different types of safety regulations to try to prevent some of that. We can have conversations with companies to try to figure out, what are we missing, right? What other safety regulations are necessary? And we are in a state where people are hesitant to put too many regulations out there, blanket. But if we can have conversations about what's necessary, what can keep people in the workforce, keep them healthy, keep them there, then we want to have those conversations and we want to make the laws that are absolutely necessary. On the other side, we want to encourage companies to hire and make accommodations for people with disabilities, right? And I should have included this too, there are more people in the labor force with a disability now than there have ever been, right? There's been a straight trend up. And that's a direct result of making accommodations and helping companies make accommodations. You are not allowed to leave yet. So it's a direct result of making accommodations, making laws that kind of say, hey, you have to have these certain accommodations for people with disabilities, even in some cases incentivizing and paying companies to hire people with disabilities and make those accommodations as necessary. And so this is also a really important one. And I know some of you are probably going, is she really an economist? Because she hasn't said anything about wages the entire time we've been here. She's talking about all this other stuff. And so this is a Mississippi particular table. And we look at what happens specifically after the pandemic when our real wages were actually changing a lot. Typically, they don't move around a lot, right? It's kind of a slow up, maybe a little down here. But post-pandemic, we've been seeing a lot of movement. And we wanted to see if that movement tends to be affecting our labor force, which as an economist, yeah. But we have to show these types of things to non-economists and to our legislators so they understand sometimes it doesn't matter how much you legislate the other things. If people aren't getting paid to where they can actually live, you might not be able to encourage them to enter the labor force. Right? They actually have to be able to pay their bills once they're in this labor force. And then educational attainment. So we talked a bit about educational attainment before, in the sense that we had these student loans that allowed people to go to college, that allowed some educational attainment and got some people out of the workforce. But it's a little bit more complicated than that, some more things that we can think about. So while it is true that the more education you have, the more likely you are to be in the labor force, but keep in mind, being in the labor force means employed and unemployed. Now, there are more people who have jobs on the higher end. But what happened also in the 70s and 80s with the latchkey babies is we were also told you have to go to college, right? You have to get a degree. And it left a hole in these what we call middle skill jobs. Jobs like plumbing, HVAC, electrician, carpentry, forklift. Like these jobs, people can actually earn a really good living, but we got a whole generation that's almost overlooked those jobs. Now, Gen Z is becoming more interested because they don't want to be in student debt, right? Because of student loan. There's always good things that sometimes have some bad consequences, right? And so student loans is a very good thing. I wouldn't be here if I wasn't allowed to take out student loans. My family could have never afforded the education that I received. But there are people who take that and they take out way more loans than they actually need, and they find themselves in some debt. And then there's people on the other end who take out very little, but then they don't finish school, and they still can't pay back. I think the default rate on loans under like $2,000, student loans, full balance of less than $2,000 is higher than the default rate on these higher $100,000. Like these are people who like went to community college or went to a 4-year school. They didn't get very far, and then they went back to work, a minimum wage job because for whatever reason they dropped out. Well, they can't pay that back. $2,000 might as well be $2 million to some of those people. So we're in the process in our state of trying to encourage all things, right? We want to encourage community college. We want to encourage apprenticeships. We want to encourage certificates for forklift and like all kinds of things so that students kind of know that you have all these options, right? Pick the option that you think is going to work best for you, and you can still have a good career, a good life, and make a decent living, whether you decide that you want to go to college or not. And I might have just run through this because this is really the last slide. So I'm open for questions. I want to, like I said, to be a conversation, to chat, maybe hear about some things, ideas you have that you think would be great for me to take back to my legislators, because we like good ideas, some things that maybe you guys have done in Georgia that I haven't already talked about. Any questions, comments?